I got an advanced screening of The Flash today. As a rule I don't care a lot for superhero movies, but this one is special. It's heartfelt.
At James Gunn, is
Hell
this
yes
true?
it is.
James Gunn hails The Flash as freaking amazing.
It's one of the best superhero movies I've ever seen. The Flash is probably one of the greatest superhero movies ever made.
David Zaslav saw The Flash 3 times. It's the
The
best
Flash
superhero
just
movie
changed
I've
my
ever seen.
life. WTF.
Tom Cruise called and spent 15 minutes praising the
We need to talk about The Flash. You may have heard about this movie, or maybe you haven't, but The Flash is such a strange phenomenon that you could honestly make a whole movie about this movie. It has undergone so many script rewrites and been in development so long that the entire Flash TV show began and ended before it came out. Warner Brothers and DC were banking so hard on its success that they brought back Michael Keaton's Batman from 30 years ago for nostalgia and ran a Super Bowl commercial, and yet it seems like they're gonna lose hundreds of millions on it regardless. Despite all of this, everyone who saw the movie before it came out sung its praises, even though the tune on that has changed dramatically since, especially among DC fans. So what's the truth? Is The Flash the greatest superhero movie of all time, or is it a mistake that should have been cancelled years ago? Normally, this is the part of the video where the reviewer says, oh, the truth is actually in the middle of these extremes and it's actually just an okay movie, or just a fun movie, but I kind of agree with Tom Cruise. Alright, it's not the greatest superhero movie of all time or anything, but I can honestly see where they were coming from. As someone who's kept up with Marvel way more than DC in recent years, I really enjoyed myself here, and I think DC did an incredible job with this movie. Let me explain by getting into my thoughts on The Flash. First of all, this movie jumps right into the action. A lot of superhero movies start off by slowly introducing the story, or maybe we get a brief scene with the villain, but we get to see Barry being the Flash pretty quickly. It's fitting for a Flash movie. Guardians 3 kinda does something similar, and it's a nice change of pace. But from there, we get to see something that we've never really seen before in these films, which is an established Justice League. Kinda like Avengers Age of Ultron. There's an established dynamic, and everybody knows each other. And to top it all off, they're working together to save people. It sounds simple, but it's just really nice to see from the DCEU, compared to what we got before. Combine that with Ben Affleck's Batman here, and it honestly felt like I was watching an animated DC movie. Batfleck moves like he's straight out of a comic book. It makes me want the director of this movie to direct the Batman movie in the DC reboot, and would you look at that, he is, so that gives me a lot of confidence in James Gunn's new Batman. It should be more mystical and less quote-unquote grounded than Robert Pattinson's Batman, which is captured perfectly here. The costume just looks a little weird. Outside of the Batsuit, Bruce Wayne is great, and his relationship with Barry is nice to see. It's really bittersweet that this is Ben Affleck's last appearance as Batman because it was just so perfect in my opinion, and yet it was so short-lived. I'm gonna miss him. As for the other characters, I've gotta say, Ezra Miller does a really great job as Barry Allen. It's almost criminal. Seriously though, they convey emotion very well when it's needed. And when there are two Barrys on the screen together, you totally forget that it's the same guy. The other Barry is a little annoying, but he becomes more likable after a certain point, in my opinion. He definitely grows on you. But I think it's really clever to have two Barrys because he serves as an insert for the audience, which the main Barry can explain things to. For example, since this Barry basically gained a ton of experience off screen, he needs to explain things like phasing and the Speed Force for those of us who aren't familiar with how the Flash works. It's a smart way to show us Barry's origin story without showing us Barry's origin story. He's also just a great foil to the main Barry, so we get to see a lot of his strengths and motivations more prominently. Michael Keaton's Batman is supposed to be this movie's biggest draw, and although he does embody the character that he's trying to play, I have to admit it's more nostalgia bait than anything. If you grew up with his Batman, then you'll probably love it, but if you're like me and you're too young for that, then you'll probably still like him, but not as much. He's essentially just the jaded old man that's inspired to return by the new generation, which is, a little cliche, but it works anyway. Overall, I have no real complaints, and I'm glad he's here. He's not as strong or compelling of a character as the alternate Batman in the Flashpoint animated movie, though, but we'll talk about that later. Supergirl is actually surprisingly not in the movie that much. I don't have that much to say about her, to be honest, but I like how they incorporated her into the story with relation to Zod and Superman. Speaking of Zod, he's a welcome addition, but he's more of a force of nature than anything. The actor for Zod came out and said that this movie wasn't fulfilling for him, and I can see why. It mostly relies on established lore from Man of Steel to prop up his threat, and doesn't bother fleshing him out beyond that. I don't mind that though, because Zod is not and should not be the focus of this movie. The core of the story revolves around Barry and his mother. In that way, he's kind of the protagonist and antagonist at the same time because he creates his own conflict. Zod's presence pushes things forward, but is nowhere near the point of the movie. In my opinion, the plot progression was pretty good. I think it's more enjoyable if you haven't seen the trailers multiple times so you don't know what to expect. It didn't drag or feel bloated despite its runtime, and I like the way that things were resolved when the film wrapped up, for the most part at least. We'll discuss the ending in the spoiler section. Anyway, the movie isn't afraid to get emotional, but it's also covered in comedy. Like, I was expecting something more serious like the Snyder films before in tone, but there's a surprising amount of jokes. That's something else that appealed to me as a Marvel fan. They're generally pretty funny, and they mostly don't insert themselves into places they don't belong, which is something Marvel has struggled with, especially recently. Marvel also infamously struggles with CGI nowadays, but I didn't notice much bad CGI in this movie, other than in the time travel scenes, which was apparently a stylistic choice. I did notice the babies in the start look like plastic dolls, though, but that's it. If you care about that, then fair enough, but poor CGI isn't a big deal to me, as long as it's pretty rare and it's not like PS2 cutscene level bad. Alright, so we're gonna talk about some spoilers real quick, so this is your formal warning. So let's talk about the ending. I thought it was cool that the heroes were just always destined to lose. That's not something you often see in superhero movies. Pretty standard for Flashpoint, but they put a unique spin on it, which is that the other Barry loses himself in trying to save that timeline. The evil version of hero thing they do is a little cliche, and it's probably the most criticized part of the movie, but I still liked it. There were better options though. Like, I would have preferred it if it was just the two Barrys fighting without the Savitar knockoff. You don't need to make him old and do the, oh, I've been doing this for 1,000 lifetimes and also I put you in this situation to begin with thing. There's enough motivation in the present. Like, this guy came to your timeline, messed everything up, and basically tells you to kill your own mom. Instead, they introduce all of that, but they resolve it with a pretty predictable sacrifice play. I digress though, it was still good. It's better than having the Reverse Flash show up out of nowhere, which only works if Barry already knows him. It works in the animated film, but we haven't seen him in live action. The cameos during this part were also interesting. It was cool to finally see Nick Cage's Superman, but I can't help but wonder why they would do that and not have Grant Gustin's Flash. Like, that has to be the most obvious cameo ever, and I don't think people care about Nick Cage's Superman. As for the comedy, most of the jokes hit, but I'll admit it went a little too far sometimes. Like, it's not Thor 4 level bad, and it's honestly funnier than some recent Marvel stuff, but some of the stuff Batman said under the lasso of truth was a bit too much, for example. And there's the matter of the final scene. The movie ends with a gag of Clooney's Batman showing up, and it's pretty funny, but it's a strange way to cap off the end of the DCEU. Not to mention that strange credit scene with Aquaman, which is obviously just there to remind people that there's another Aquaman movie coming soon. They could have had like a thank you card to Henry Cavill and Ben Affleck at the end or something. I enjoyed the movie overall, but the ending was a little strange. From leaks of previous scripts, we can see that the original ending for the movie was some variation of a bunch of heroes congratulating Barry in court. This probably would have been a much nicer ending, and since we already know this universe is over, you could have just had literally everyone in the last scene as like a collective swan song. Having Clooney instead is a little confusing and kinda makes it seem like he's the new Batman, which he's not. I saw someone suggest that Keaton's Batman should write a note for Batfleck to treasure his time with Alfred, and that would have been great instead of the gag ending that we got. It's a nice way to emulate the original Flashpoint story, even though the Batman relationship here is fundamentally different. Speaking of which, since this film is loosely based off of the Flashpoint Paradox story, you might be wondering, well, how does this movie compare to the animated film? I would say that the animated film is better, but they both have their unique strengths and weaknesses. The Flashpoint animated movie has a much wider reach within the DC universe, and we see a lot of different characters in the alternate timeline, where the team we have in this movie is pretty small. The stakes also feel somewhat smaller by comparison. The Flashpoint movie has an amazing Batman dynamic between the timelines, but in this movie, Keaton's Batman isn't that different from Batfleck. However, The biggest strength of this movie has to be its portrayal of Barry's backstory and motivations. It's very fleshed out, they show you flashbacks, and you actually see his parents. The emotional scenes with Ezra Miller really hit home and might even bring you to tears. It's just an inherent advantage that live action has over animation. You can really sympathize with him. In contrast, I always felt like the animated movie didn't do much to invest you in Barry's tragedy. A lot of people have said that they should have just adapted Flashpoint directly. Although it would have been cool to see it in live action, that's just sort of boring and predictable to me. I would much rather have what we ended up getting, which takes inspiration from the original and carries some major story beats while remaining fresh. There are a few similarities between the animated film and this one, but there are enough differences that you can have a really good time with both. My overall rating for The Flash is probably an 8.5 out of 10. Might be a hot take, but I really enjoyed this movie. It did justice to the Flashpoint story without completely copying it. I'm a little sad that this movie is doing poorly, but I'm not shocked. Even though it's a good movie, Warner Brothers kinda deserves it for running DC into the ground and keeping a serial criminal on board. I'm surprised about how harsh the reception has been though. It's bordering on rotten, and the cinema score is the same as Batman v Superman for some reason, and I think that's just crazy. The DC subreddit has gone back to hating on James Gunn and dropped the goodwill he just got for Guardians 3. In my opinion, this is just excessive. It might just be because it became so overhyped and everyone got spoiled by the trailers. If your expectations are in check and you've managed to avoid most of the marketing like I have, then maybe you'll like it. It may not be the best superhero movie of all time, but it's really good and it belongs at the top of the DCEU. I'd recommend it to anyone who's a fan of these characters. So go buy your tickets, or maybe just pirate it.
This is